In the final days of the 18th century, as Europe stood on the brink of a new era, a boy born on a remote Mediterranean island would rise to become one of history's most compelling and controversial figures. That boy was Napoleone di Buonaparte, later known as Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would bend empires to his will, reshape the continent, and leave an indelible mark on the modern world. Napoleon was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica. Only a few months after the island had been transferred from Genoese to French control. His family, of minor Italian nobility, had deep roots in Corsica's turbulent past and were ardent supporters of Corsican independence before accepting French rule. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, became a representative of Corsica to the court of Louis XVI, allowing young Napoleon to receive a French education and a foothold into the broader world. He was sent to mainland France to study at a series of military academies, including the École Militaire in Paris. His accent, provincial origins, and status as a scholarship student marked him as an outsider among the children of the French aristocracy. Nevertheless, he excelled in mathematics, history, and artillery, earning his commission as a second lieutenant in the French army in 1785 at the age of just 16. Napoleon's early military career coincided with the most turbulent period in French history, the French Revolution. The collapse of the Ancien Regime, the rise of Republican fervor, and the execution of the king created both chaos and opportunity. Napoleon aligned himself with the Jacobins, the most radical faction of revolutionaries, and used his connections to climb the ranks rapidly. His first major success came in 1793, during the Siege of Toulon, a key port city held by royalist forces and British troops. Napoleon proposed a bold plan to seize strategic high ground, which led to a decisive victory. For his role, he was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. The Republic had found in him a brilliant and daring military mind. However, revolutionary France was unstable, and so was Napoleon's position. After the fall of the Jacobins and Robespierre's execution in 1794, he briefly fell out of favor. But his fortunes turned again in 1795 when he put down a royalist uprising in Paris using a whiff of grape shot, a ruthless but effective show of force that saved the government and earned him national fame. The following year, at only 26, he was given command of the French Army of Italy, a post traditionally reserved for experienced generals. It was here that Napoleon's genius began to fully reveal itself. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 was a dazzling series of victories. With a poorly equipped army, he defeated larger Austrian and Piedmontese forces, captured northern Italy, and forced Austria to sue for peace. He was not just a soldier. He was a statesman, negotiating treaties and reorganizing republics. His reputation soared, portraits were painted, poems were written, and his name became synonymous with revolutionary glory. But Napoleon was not content with being a general. He dreamed of empire, of destiny, of glory on a scale few could imagine. He began to fashion a myth around himself, a man of the people who commanded the heavens and rewrote the fates of nations. In 1798, he set out on an ambitious campaign to Egypt. His goal was to strike at British trade routes and establish a French presence in the East. Though the Egyptian campaign had mixed military results, with the destruction of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile by Admiral Nelson, It showcased Napoleon's ambition and his vision of global influence. He brought with him scientists, engineers, and scholars, initiating one of the earliest examples of military-led cultural exploration, the discovery of the... But while he was in Egypt, the political situation in France deteriorated. The Directory, the ruling executive body, had lost public support, and there was widespread dissatisfaction. Napoleon sensed his moment. In 1799, he left his army in Egypt and returned to France, where he was greeted as a hero. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon orchestrated a coup d'état. With the support of key military allies and a calculated manipulation of legislative procedures, he dissolved the Directory and established the consulate, with himself as first consul, effectively the leader of France. In a matter of days, a young general from Corsica had seized control of one of the most powerful nations in Europe. The revolution, which had begun with ideals of liberty and democracy, had produced a ruler with near absolute power. But for many in France, Napoleon represented order, strength, and hope after years of bloodshed and instability. In the next chapter, we will explore how Napoleon, now at the helm of France, would consolidate power, reform the state, confront old enemies, and set his sights on an imperial crown. With the successful coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte transitioned from general to statesman, from military hero to political architect. As first consul of France, he now held supreme power, though the Republic was preserved in form. In reality, a new order was emerging, one centered around a single man who wielded both the sword and the pen, promising stability after years of chaos. One of Napoleon's first priorities was to restore order to a nation still reeling from the upheavals of revolution. His reforms were sweeping and pragmatic. He centralized the administration, bringing coherence to a fractured bureaucracy. He reorganized local governments, restructured the tax system to increase efficiency, and began to rebuild the nation's infrastructure. Roads were repaired, public buildings restored, and urban sanitation improved. France was beginning to look like a country again. Perhaps his most lasting contribution to civil life was the establishment of the Napoleonic Code, or Code Civil, in 1804. This legal code standardized laws across France, replacing a patchwork of feudal and regional systems. It emphasized property rights, secular authority, the sanctity of contracts, and civil equality for men. Though women's rights remained severely restricted, the code represented a modern, rational legal framework that would influence dozens of countries for generations. Education also became a central pillar of Napoleon's regime. He believed that a strong, unified nation required an educated citizenry. He created a system of lycées, state-run secondary schools, to train future civil servants and officers. Universities were restructured, and specialized institutions like the École Polytechnique were supported. Napoleon's educational vision was utilitarian and hierarchical, designed to serve the state and reward merit. To shore up his authority, he sought reconciliation with the Catholic Church, which had been severely weakened during the Revolution. In 1801, Napoleon signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, re-establishing the Church in France while maintaining state supremacy. Bishops were nominated by the government, the clergy were paid by the state, and Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the majority. This agreement pacified religious tensions and restored legitimacy to his rule. Meanwhile, Napoleon's military prowess remained undiminished. In 1800, he led his army across the Alps in a dramatic campaign against Austria. The Battle of Marengo, fought in northern Italy, was a hard-won victory that reasserted French dominance in the region. It was not just a military triumph. It was a theatrical event, cementing his image as a commander of destiny. Back in France, he cultivated his public image with care. Portraits by Jacques-Louis David showed him as a heroic figure, crossing the Alps on a rearing steed or standing regally in coronation robes. Propaganda and press control were tools of governance. The press was censored, and dissenting voices were silenced. Napoleon understood the power of narrative, and he sought to shape it at every turn. In 1802, a referendum confirmed his position as first consul for life. Though still cloaked in the rhetoric of republicanism, France was steadily moving toward monarchy, and in 1804 the transformation was complete. In a lavish ceremony held at Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, a bold statement that he owed his authority to no one but himself. Pope Pius VII attended but was relegated to a supporting role, underscoring Napoleon's independence. The establishment of the empire marked a new phase in European politics. Napoleon distributed titles to loyal generals and administrators, re-established a nobility of merit, and created a court with imperial grandeur. Yet, the ideals of the revolution, equality, liberty, fraternity, were not entirely lost. Napoleon believed in meritocracy, efficient governance, and the modernization of society. But these were now harnessed to the glory of the emperor. Abroad, monarchies watched with increasing alarm. Britain, having signed a temporary peace with France in 1802, renewed hostilities in 1803. Napoleon planned a massive invasion of the British Isles and gathered an army at Boulogne, but his plans were foiled by British naval supremacy. Admiral Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 ensured British control of the seas and dashed Napoleon's hopes of crossing the Channel. Instead, he turned eastward. In December 1805, Napoleon achieved one of his most brilliant victories at the Battle of Austerlitz, defeating the combined armies of Austria and Russia. Known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, Austerlitz was a masterpiece of strategy. It forced Austria to sue for peace and led to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states under Napoleon's influence. This was the zenith of his power. He was Emperor of the French, master of Central Europe, and the shaper of a new continental order. But with every triumph, his ambition grew. The next years would see the expansion of his empire, the entrenchment of his reforms, and the emergence of new coalitions bent on his defeat. In the next chapter, we will explore the height of Napoleon's empire, the restructuring of Europe, his family dynasty, and the far-reaching effects of his continental system and military campaigns. By the year 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the pinnacle of his power. He had crowned himself Emperor of the French, defeated multiple European coalitions, and redrawn the political map of the continent. From Lisbon to Warsaw, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, Europe seemed to revolve around the gravitational force of one man's ambition. But this era of glory, expansion, and reform also sowed the seeds of unrest, resistance, and eventual downfall. Napoleon was not content with ruling France alone. He sought to export his revolutionary reforms and consolidate his control over Europe by crafting a network of satellite states and loyal rulers, many of them his own relatives. This dynastic project was unprecedented in its scale and intent. His brothers Joseph, Louis, and Jérôme were placed on the thrones of Naples, Holland, and Westphalia, respectively. His stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, was made Viceroy of Italy, and his brother-in-law, Joachim Murat W. These rulers, while nominally sovereign, operated under strict direction from Paris. Napoleon's civil reforms, the Napoleonic Code, centralized administration, educational institutions, and modernized tax systems were implemented across these regions. In theory, he was bringing order and progress. In practice, many saw his rule as authoritarian and exploitative. Local populations were often taxed heavily to support his wars, and resistance simmered beneath the surface. In 1806, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, effectively ending the Holy Roman Empire. This confederation of German states was under French protection and influence, further cementing his role as the master of Central Europe. However, this alarmed Prussia, which had remained neutral during recent conflicts. Sensing a threat to its sovereignty, Prussia mobilized for war. The resulting War of the Fourth Coalition saw Napoleon deliver another crushing victory at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt in October 1806. The Prussian army, steeped in traditions of Frederick the Great, was swiftly outmaneuvered and humiliated. Berlin was occupied and French troops marched triumphantly through the Prussian capital. The psychological impact of this victory was enormous. Prussia, once a proud military power, was humbled in weeks. But Russia, still reeling from Austerlitz, regrouped and joined the coalition. The brutal winter campaign of 1806-1807 culminated in the bloody Battle of Eylau and the decisive French victory at Friedland. Napoleon met with Tsar Alexander the Hun in the middle of the Niemen River and signed the Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807. This treaty redrew the map once more. Prussia was dismembered. A new Duchy of Warsaw was created from Polish lands, and France and Russia agreed, for the moment, to divide Europe into Yet peace remained elusive. Napoleon turned his attention to the British, who continued to defy him from across the Channel. Since direct invasion was no longer possible after Trafalgar, he initiated the Continental System, a vast economic blockade designed to paralyze Britain by cutting off its trade with mainland Europe. All French-controlled territories were to cease commercial relations with the British. In theory, the Continental System was a bold form of economic warfare. In practice, it proved difficult to enforce and economically damaging to many European nations. Smuggling thrived, and resentment grew. Many neutral countries, particularly in Northern Europe, chafed under the restrictions. When Portugal refused to comply, Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula, triggering the Peninsular War in 1808. The invasion of Spain and Portugal proved to be one of Napoleon's greatest mistakes. Although he quickly deposed the Spanish Bourbon monarchs and installed his brother Joseph on the throne, the Spanish people rose in fierce resistance. Guerrilla warfare, supported by British troops under the Duke of Wellington, turned Spain into a quagmire. For the first time, Napoleon's forces faced a protracted popular uprising. The Peninsular War drained resources and exposed the limits of imperial control. Meanwhile, Napoleon's domestic life also underwent transformation. In 1810, after divorcing his beloved but childless wife Josephine, he married Marie Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, to solidify an alliance and secure a legitimate heir. In 1811, the birth of Napoleon II, titled the King of Rome, seemed to assure the continuation of his dynasty. But even as his family expanded and his empire reached its territorial peak, opposition was mounting. Nationalist movements stirred in Spain, Germany, and Italy. Russia grew wary of French domination and resented the continental system. Britain remained an unyielding foe, financing coalitions and striking at French interests around the globe. Napoleon's empire, though vast, was held together by force, charisma, and a relentless pursuit of expansion. The cracks were beginning to show. In the next chapter, we will witness the campaign that would prove to be his undoing, the invasion of Russia in 1812, and the beginning of his dramatic descent from the heights of power. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the largest and most powerful empire Europe had seen since the days of Rome. But like all empires, it was fragile beneath the surface, a vast, overstretched web held together by diplomacy, conquest, and his singular will. The next step in Napoleon's vision of continental dominance would prove catastrophic: the invasion of Russia. Tensions with Russia had been growing ever since the Treaty of Tilsit. Tsar Alexander I, initially cooperative, began to chafe under the constraints of the continental system, which hurt Russian trade and strained relations with neutral countries. Russian nobles and merchants, increasingly resentful of French economic interference and political influence, pushed for a break with France. By 1811, it was clear that the alliance was unraveling. Napoleon, unwilling to tolerate disobedience or challenge, resolved to bring Russia back into line by force. In June 1812, he launched what would become one of the most infamous military campaigns in history. The Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 soldiers from across Europe, crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. It was the largest army ever assembled for a single invasion. At first, the march was slow and unopposed. The Russians, under Generals Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, employed a strategy of strategic withdrawal and scorched earth. Villages were burned, supplies destroyed, and no decisive battles offered. The French were drawn deeper into the vastness of Russia, their supply lines stretched thin, their morale fraying under the summer heat and lack of provisions. In September 1812, Napoleon reached the outskirts of Moscow, having fought and narrowly won the bloody Battle of Borodino, one of the deadliest single-day engagements in the Napoleonic Wars. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded. Though technically a victory, the battle failed to deliver a decisive blow to the Russian army or compel a surrender. Napoleon entered a nearly abandoned Moscow, expecting to find peace terms. Instead, the city was engulfed in flames, many of them deliberately set. With no Russian delegation, no food, and no clear path forward, Napoleon hesitated. Weeks passed. The cold crept in. His army, already weakened by disease and attrition, began to suffer the first whispers of winter. In October, realizing he could not remain in the ruined city, Napoleon ordered a retreat. What followed was a nightmare. The infamous Russian winter arrived early and brutally. Temperatures plunged. Frostbite, starvation, disease, and constant harassment by Russian forces decimated the retreating army. Horses died by the thousands. Artillery was abandoned. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered back across the Niemen River in December 1812, fewer than 100,000 men remained. It was not just a defeat. It was a catastrophe. Napoleon had lost the core of his military power, and with it, his aura of invincibility. Europe, stunned by the scale of the disaster, sensed opportunity. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and later Austria, formed in response. In 1813, the War of the Sixth Coalition began in earnest. Napoleon, ever the strategist, raised new armies with astonishing speed, but the quality and cohesion of his forces had diminished. In the spring and summer of 1813, he won several tactical victories, including at Lutzen and Bautzen, but the tide was turning. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the so-called Battle of the Nations, Napoleon faced a united Allied force of over 300,000 men. Outnumbered and encircled, he was decisively defeated. The French retreated, and the German states began to defect. The French front collapsed. By early 1814, the Allies had invaded France itself. Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign, winning several engagements despite dwindling numbers. Yet it was clear he could not withstand the combined might of Europe indefinitely. In March 1814, Paris was captured. Napoleon was forced to abdicate in April and was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. He retained the title of emperor and was granted sovereignty over the island. Though he remained under guard, he was allowed a small retinue and given some degree of autonomy. Europe exhaled. The nightmare was over, or so it seemed. Louis XVI was restored to the French throne, and the Congress of Vienna convened to redraw the map of Europe. But Napoleon was not finished. In less than a year, he would escape Elba and return to France for one final dramatic act on the world stage. In the next chapter, we will follow his audacious return during the 100 Days, his final stand at Waterloo, and the lasting legacy of a man who, even in defeat, continued to shape history. The exile of Napoleon to Elba in 1814 seemed to mark the final chapter in the saga of the man who had ruled Europe for over a decade. Yet Napoleon Bonaparte was not content to fade into history. Less than a year after his abdication, he staged one of the most dramatic political comebacks in history, a brief but intense resurgence known as the 100 Days. While on Elba, Napoleon kept a watchful eye on the political situation in France and Europe. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVI was already unpopular. Many veterans felt betrayed. Royalist policies alienated large segments of the population, and the economic situation remained fragile. Rumors circulated of Napoleon's enduring popularity, especially among the army. Sensing weakness and driven by his own restlessness, Napoleon made his move. On February 26, 1815, he escaped Elba aboard a small vessel and landed near Cannes on March 1st with around 1,000 men. His gamble was audacious. As he marched north through France, regiments sent to arrest him instead joined him. Soldiers, he is said to have declared, "If there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." None stepped forward. By the time he reached Paris on March 20th, he had retaken the throne without firing a shot. Europe reacted with alarm. The powers at the Congress of Vienna, still in the midst of redrawing the post-Napoleonic world, immediately declared him an outlaw and enemy of the peace. The Seventh Coalition, composed of Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and several smaller states, mobilized for war. Napoleon knew he had little time. His strategy was to strike swiftly and defeat the Allied armies in detail before they could fully unite. In June 1815, he launched an offensive into Belgium, hoping to divide and conquer the Anglo-Prussian forces. He defeated the Prussians at Ligny, but a simultaneous engagement at Quatre Bras against the British left them still in the field. Then came Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, near the Belgian town of Waterloo, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army. It was a rainy morning, and the battlefield was sodden, complicating maneuvers. Napoleon delayed his attack, hoping the ground would dry. This allowed the Prussian army under Marshal Blucher to regroup and begin marching to the battlefield. The battle raged for hours. French attacks were fierce and initially effective. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite troops, were held in reserve for a decisive blow. Yet the British lines, bolstered by reinforcements, held firm. When the Prussians finally arrived on Napoleon's flank, the tide turned. A final charge by the Imperial Guard was repulsed, and the French army broke. Napoleon had been defeated. He returned to Paris in disgrace. Facing political pressure and military collapse, he abdicated again on June 22, 1815. This time there would be no leniency. The British refused to allow him to live in exile in Europe. Instead, he was sent to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, a place chosen for its isolation and difficulty of escape. On St. Helena, Napoleon was kept under close watch by the British. He lived in Longwood House, a damp and windswept residence far from any town. Though he was allowed a small entourage, his movements were restricted, and he was under constant surveillance. He spent his time reading, dictating his memoirs, and walking through the barren landscape. Cut off from the world he once commanded, he reflected on his life, his achievements, and his failures. In 1821, after several years of declining health, likely exacerbated by stomach cancer, Napoleon died. His last words were reported to be, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine." He was buried on the island under a simple stone, as the British refused to allow his body to be returned to France. The world had lost one of its most extraordinary figures. A man who had risen from relative obscurity to become emperor, who had redrawn maps, redefined warfare, and left an enduring legacy in law, governance, and myth. But his story did not end with his death. In the next chapter, we will explore how Napoleon's legacy endured, how he was remembered, vilified, romanticized, and ultimately transformed into a symbol that transcended his lifetime and reshaped European memory for generations to come. After Napoleon's death on St. Helena in 1821, the world began the complex task of interpreting and remembering his legacy. He was no longer merely a military leader or deposed emperor. He had become a figure of legend. His memory sparked debates, inspired revolutions, and haunted the halls of power across Europe. Over the decades, Napoleon would be remembered not only for what he did, but for what he represented: ambition, reform, tyranny and the enduring power of one man to shape history. In France, Napoleon's legacy was immediately contested. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVI and later Charles II sought to minimize his influence, portraying him as a usurper and warmonger. They banned images and songs about him and tried to erase his presence from public life. But these efforts were in vain. Among the people, especially veterans and Republicans, he remained a hero. His reforms had modernized France, his victories had brought national pride, and his mythic stature had only grown. Throughout the 19th century, France underwent a series of political upheavals, and Napoleon's image evolved with each. The July monarchy of Louis Philippe cautiously rehabilitated his memory, and the Second Republic, established after the Revolution of 1848, fully embraced it. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, capitalized on the family name to win the presidency in 1848, and later declared himself Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, invoking the legacy of his uncle as the justification for a new empire. Meanwhile, across Europe and beyond, Napoleon became both model and cautionary tale. Nationalists in Italy, Germany, and Poland admired his consolidation of power and saw in him a champion of self-determination, despite his imperial ambitions. Liberal reformers praised his administrative genius and legal reforms. Reactionary monarchs and conservative thinkers, on the other hand, cited Napoleon as a warning about the dangers of concentrated power and revolutionary fervor. The Romantic movement also played a central role in shaping Napoleon's posthumous image. Writers such as Victor Hugo, Lord Byron, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe portrayed him as a tragic, titanic figure, a man of exceptional will and intellect brought low by fate and hubris. Painters, composers, and sculptors similarly elevated him to almost mythological status. He was no longer merely historical, he was symbolic. In the realm of military studies, Napoleon's campaigns became essential reading for strategists and officers. His use of mass conscription, corps organization, rapid movement, and concentration of force revolutionized warfare. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst studied his battles, his maxims, and his leadership style. Generals in later conflicts, from the American Civil War to World War I, invoked his name and tried to emulate his tactics. Culturally, Napoleon became a fixture. His silhouette, bicorn hat, and hand-in-waistcoat pose were instantly recognizable. His quotes, whether real or apocryphal, circulated widely. His life was chronicled in countless biographies, novels, and plays. Napoleon-themed memorabilia filled homes, cafes, and barracks. He became a brand, a symbol, a ghost haunting Europe's imagination. In 1840, his remains were returned to France in a grand ceremony known as the Retour des Cendres. Thousands lined the streets of Paris to watch the procession. His body was interred at Les Invalides in a sarcophagus beneath a golden dome. It was a moment of national catharsis, France reclaiming its prodigal son. Throughout the 20th century, Napoleon's legacy continued to evolve. Historians re-examined his rule with greater nuance, debating whether he was a dictator or reformer, a product of the revolution or its betrayer. The two world wars, the rise of fascism, and the emergence of the European Union all influenced how his life was interpreted. For some, he was a proto-fascist. For others, a visionary ahead of his time. In modern France, his legacy remains ambivalent. Streets, statues, and schools bear his name. His military genius and administrative reforms are still admired, but his authoritarianism, wars of conquest, and treatment of women and minorities have drawn increasing scrutiny. Public debates about his role in history reflect broader questions about identity, memory, and the meaning of greatness. Globally, Napoleon remains one of the most studied and written about figures in human history. His life encapsulates the tensions between freedom and control, ambition and responsibility, genius and downfall. Whether viewed as a hero or villain, he remains unforgettable. In the next chapter, we will examine the monuments, places, and cultural artifacts that preserve Napoleon's memory across the world. From the streets of Paris to the battlefields of Europe and the faraway island where he drew his final breath, the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte is etched not only in books and political debates, but also in stone, landscape, and culture. Across the globe, monuments, museums, battlefields, and buildings serve as physical reminders of his life and legend. These sites preserve memory, invite reflection, and testify to the enduring fascination with the man who once ruled a continent. In Paris, the heart of Napoleon's empire, his presence is everywhere. The Arc de Triomphe, commissioned in 1806 after his victory at Austerlitz, looms over the Place Charles de Gaulle as a monumental symbol of military glory. Engraved on its inner walls are the names of battles and generals from the Napoleonic Wars. Beneath it lies the tomb of the unknown soldier, linking Napoleon's past to modern remembrance. Just a few kilometers away, the Hôtel des Invalides houses Napoleon's remains in a grand sarcophagus beneath the Golden Dome. His body, returned from St. Helena in 1840, rests surrounded by statues representing his achievements and virtues. It is a site of national pilgrimage, visited by scholars, soldiers, and curious travelers alike. The Louvre, though most famous for its artistic treasures, also bears the mark of Napoleon. During his reign, he expanded the museum significantly and enriched it with spoils from his military campaigns. His influence on the institution helped transform it from a royal collection into a public national museum, a legacy that endures today. Beyond France, the traces of Napoleon's passage are visible across Europe. In Italy, cities like Milan and Venice still showcase architectural projects and legal reforms instituted during his rule. The Napoleonic Code laid the groundwork for modern legal systems in much of southern and eastern Europe, and its principles remain embedded in European civil law traditions. Germany, once fragmented into dozens of small states under the Holy Roman Empire, was dramatically reorganized under Napoleon's influence. Though intended to serve French interests, the Confederation of the Rhine set the stage for later unification efforts. In Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden, memorials and museums explore both the defeats and impacts of his campaigns. In Russia, especially near Borodino and Smolensk, memorials honor those who resisted the French invasion of 1812. The ruins of burned towns, battlefield markers, and reconstructed trenches stand as a solemn tribute to the price paid in what remains one of the most devastating military campaigns in history. The Iberian Peninsula, scarred by the Peninsular War, also holds vivid reminders. In Spain and Portugal, small towns still commemorate battles with plaques and festivals. Museums in Madrid, Lisbon, and Salamanca recount the fierce resistance that turned Napoleon's occupation into a bleeding wound that drained his empire. In the United Kingdom, while Napoleon never set foot on British soil, he loomed large in the public imagination. His adversaries, from Admiral Nelson to the Duke of Wellington, became national icons. The Battle of Waterloo is commemorated at the Waterloo battlefield in Belgium, where visitors can see the Lion's Mound, a panoramic museum, and restored battle positions that recreate the final clash. Even in St. Helena, the remote island of his final exile, Napoleon is remembered. Longwood House, where he spent his last years, has been preserved and restored. The original burial site, known as the Valley of the Tomb, is a quiet, secluded place surrounded by nature. Though his remains were moved to Paris, the site continues to draw visitors who wish to understand the last chapter of his life. Beyond physical monuments, Napoleon's legacy is preserved in cultural institutions. Military academies teach his strategies. Universities analyze his political thought. Art museums display portraits, battle scenes, and allegories of his rise and fall. His impact is also felt in place names, from towns in the United States called Napoleon or Bonaparte to streets, schools, and parks across continents. In cinema, literature, and theater, Napoleon has been portrayed countless times as hero, villain, genius, or madman. Directors like Abel Gance and Stanley Kubrick, whose Napoleon project remains legendary despite never being filmed, sought to capture his life's scope. Authors from Tolstoy to Dumas have fictionalized him, while philosophers like Hegel viewed him as the embodiment of the world spirit on horseback. His image has even appeared in fashion, advertising, and music. The bicorn hat and military coat are instantly recognizable, evoking command and charisma. From operas to rock albums, from political cartoons to luxury brands, Napoleon's silhouette has become cultural shorthand for ambition and power. In the next chapter, we will explore how Napoleon's personal relationships with his family, allies, and adversaries shaped his life, informed his decisions, and revealed the human behind the legend. Behind the towering myth of Napoleon Bonaparte lies the man, complex, driven, charismatic, and deeply human. His relationships, both political and personal, offer a window into the soul of the emperor. From family alliances to bitter rivalries, from passionate romances to moments of isolation, these connections shaped his path and revealed the vulnerabilities that no battlefield could hide. Family was central to Napoleon's vision of empire. He came from modest Corsican nobility and carried with him a profound sense of familial loyalty, though it often clashed with political pragmatism. As his power grew, he elevated his siblings and relatives to positions of influence, creating a sprawling dynastic web across Europe. His older brother Joseph became King of Naples and later Spain. Louis was made King of Holland, and Jérôme ruled the Kingdom of Westphalia. His stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais. These appointments were not without tension. Napoleon often clashed with his siblings over policy and loyalty. Louis resisted French control in Holland, prioritizing Dutch interests over imperial directives. Joseph failed to stabilize Spain, undermined by a fierce guerrilla war and his own indecision. Jérôme's lavish lifestyle and mismanagement in Westphalia drew criticism. Despite his best efforts, Napoleon's imperial family was far from unified. His relationship with his first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, was one of intense emotion and deep affection. They met shortly after the Revolution. She was a widowed aristocrat with 2 children, and he, a rising general. Their courtship was passionate, and their marriage in 1796 helped secure Napoleon's place in French society. While Josephine was older and politically astute, she was also unfaithful early in their marriage, fueling Napoleon's own infidelities during his campaigns. Despite personal betrayals, their bond endured for years. Josephine brought sophistication and charm to the imperial court. However, her failure to produce an heir weighed heavily on Napoleon, whose desire for dynastic continuity became increasingly urgent. In 1810, with genuine regret, he divorced Josephine and married Marie-Louise of Austria, a union that served both personal and political aims. Their son, Napoleon II, known as the King of Rome, was born the following year. Napoleon's relationship with Marie-Louise was more reserved, though reportedly affectionate. She was only 18 at the time of their marriage, while Napoleon was in his 40s. She adapted to her new role with grace, giving him the heir he craved. But after his fall in 1814, she returned to Austria and never joined him again, even during his final exile. Among his military circle, Napoleon inspired both loyalty and rivalry. Marshals such as Ney, Murat, Lannes, Berthier, and Davout formed the backbone of his campaigns. Some, like Davout, earned a reputation for discipline and brilliance. Others, like Murat, who was also his brother-in-law, were bold but impetuous. Ney, the bravest of the brave, remained loyal even during Napoleon's final days, only to be executed by the Bourbons after Waterloo. Napoleon's leadership style combined meritocracy with personal trust. He rewarded competence, promoted based on skill rather than birth, and demanded total commitment. But he could also be harsh, dismissive, and prone to replacing commanders for perceived disloyalty. His immense expectations created pressure that few could endure for long. Politically, his relationships with foreign leaders were defined by ambition and manipulation. He negotiated, flattered, threatened, and made alliances as needed. His interactions with Tsar Alexander I of Russia ranged from cordial cooperation at Tilsit to bitter enmity by 1812. With Austrian Emperor Francis I, he sought legitimacy through marriage, but remained fundamentally mistrustful. He dismissed the British as a nation of shopkeepers, but admired their naval prowess and institutional strength. Napoleon also had a complicated relationship with the French people. He rose as their protector during the chaos of the Revolution, offering stability and glory. His domestic reforms, from the Napoleonic Code to public education and centralized administration, won him support. Yet his wars cost millions of lives. His censorship, secret police, and autocratic style alienated Republicans. He was both adored and feared, the embodiment of France's strength and its burden. In exile, he reflected on these relationships with a mixture of pride and bitterness. In his memoirs, dictated to companions on St. Helena, he spoke fondly of Josephine, praised his marshals, and defended his decisions. Yet there was also regret for lost opportunities, for betrayals, and for the isolation that comes with absolute power. In the next chapter, we will delve into Napoleon's intellectual world, his writings, philosophical influences, views on religion, and the ideas that animated his vision of empire and civilization. Napoleon Bonaparte was more than a soldier and ruler. He was a thinker, a strategist, and an intellectual in his own right. Throughout his life, he immersed himself in history, philosophy, literature, and political theory. His ideas, though often shaped by pragmatic needs, reflected a coherent vision of civilization, order, and human potential. Understanding his intellectual world is essential to grasping the motivations and contradictions that defined his rule. From a young age, Napoleon was a voracious reader. While studying at military academies, he read widely in history, classical literature, and Enlightenment philosophy. He admired figures such as Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Charlemagne, conquerors who combined martial prowess with state-building. Their examples helped shape his ambition to transcend the role of general and become a civilizing force. The Enlightenment deeply influenced his worldview. He read the works of Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Machiavelli, absorbing ideas about reason, governance, and human nature. Voltaire's rationalism and anti-clericalism appealed to Napoleon's secular instincts. Rousseau's concept of the general will and belief in meritocracy resonated with his sense of justice and order, even as Napoleon rejected Rousseau's romanticism and emphasis on emotion. Napoleon often spoke of his mission as bringing order out of chaos. He viewed himself as a modernizer, someone who could cut through the inefficiencies of the old regimes and establish rational institutions. The Napoleonic Code, arguably his greatest legislative achievement, codified Enlightenment ideals: equality before the law, protection of property rights, secular authority, and the primacy of civil institutions over feudal privileges. Yet Napoleon was no pure ideologue. He used ideas as tools, adapting them to the realities of governance and war. He believed in centralized power and distrusted political pluralism. For him, stability was more important than abstract liberty. He often dismissed parliamentary debate as inefficient and preferred swift executive decision-making. In this sense, he embodied a paradox: the revolutionary who feared revolution, the Enlightenment ruler who curtailed freedom of speech and press. Religion was another domain where his views were both strategic and philosophical. Napoleon was personally skeptical of religious dogma, often describing religion as a useful means to control and comfort the masses. Yet he recognized its political importance. The 1801 Concordat with the Catholic Church re-established religious peace in France, while maintaining state supremacy over the clergy. He saw religion as a pillar of social order, not a source of metaphysical truth. His speeches and proclamations often invoked a grand narrative of civilization. Whether marching into Egypt or reforming the institutions of occupied territories, Napoleon presented himself as a liberator and educator. In Egypt, he brought scientists, engineers, and artists, an early version of cultural diplomacy. Though the campaign was militarily inconclusive, it launched the field of Egyptology and symbolized his desire to marry conquest with enlightenment. Napoleon's understanding of power was deeply informed by Machiavelli. He believed in the effectiveness of fear, the need for decisive action, and the art of political theater. He mastered symbolism, the coronation in Notre Dame, the use of imperial regalia, the strategic deployment of bulletins from the front. All were calculated to shape public perception and reinforce his authority. His view of history was cyclical and moralistic. He believed that great men could shape the destiny of nations, but only if they seized the moment. He once said, "Ability is nothing without opportunity." He viewed himself as an instrument of destiny, chosen by fate and history to fulfill a transformative role. This belief fueled his audacity and self-confidence, but also led to misjudgments and hubris. In exile, especially on St. Helena, Napoleon reflected deeply on his intellectual legacy. He dictated memoirs, commentaries, and philosophical reflections to his companions. These writings are rich in self-justification, but also in insight. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood reformer, a man of vision betrayed by petty monarchs and short-sighted politicians. Whether one agrees with this portrayal or not, it reveals a mind still engaged with the forces that had shaped his world. In the next chapter, we will examine the cultural and artistic representations of Napoleon during his life and after, how painters, writers, musicians, and filmmakers contributed to the enduring myth of the emperor. Throughout his life and long after his death, Napoleon Bonaparte became a subject of artistic fascination. Artists, writers, composers, and filmmakers across centuries and continents have sought to capture, critique, and commemorate his image. The cultural representations of Napoleon are as varied as they are numerous, ranging from solemn tributes to biting satires, all contributing to the construction of a myth that has transcended time. In painting, Napoleon's image was shaped early on by Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical master whose style aligned perfectly with the grandeur of the Napoleonic project. David's portraits, such as Napoleon crossing the Alps, presented him as a heroic, almost divine figure, calm amidst chaos, leading his troops toward glory. These images were carefully curated for public consumption, turning Napoleon into a visual symbol of strength, intellect, and control. Other painters followed suit. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, Antoine Jean Gros, and François Gérard depicted Napoleon in coronation robes on the battlefield or in moments of contemplative leadership. These works, many commissioned by the state, reinforced his legitimacy and fed the cult of personality. Even after his fall, these images continued to circulate, giving visual form to nostalgia and reverence. Caricature and satire, particularly in Britain, offered a counterpoint. Artists like James Gillray and George Cruikshank produced scathing cartoons mocking Napoleon's ambitions, stature, and egotism. He was depicted as a tyrant, a monster, or a comically overreaching figure. These images played a vital role in shaping public opinion, especially during wartime, and demonstrated the power of visual art to influence politics. Literature, too, embraced Napoleon with complexity. During his rise and reign, he was praised in patriotic poetry and political essays. After his fall, writers began to explore the deeper meanings of his life. Romantic poets like Lord Byron saw in him a tragic hero, a man of towering ambition brought down by fate and flaw. In his poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Byron writes of Napoleon as a ruin amidst ruins, evoking both admiration and melancholy. Victor Hugo in Les Miserables evokes the memory of Waterloo with both grandeur and grief, portraying the battle as a turning point not just for France, but for European destiny. Tolstoy's War and Peace casts Napoleon in a more critical light, a brilliant but ultimately deluded man, outmatched by the spirit of the Russian people and the unpredictability of history. In music, Napoleon's legacy is marked by irony. Ludwig van Beethoven originally dedicated his Third Symphony, the Eroica, to Napoleon, believing him a champion of republican ideals. But when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Beethoven angrily rescinded the dedication, writing Bonaparte into the title page, only to scratch it out with such force that the paper was torn. The Eroica remains a powerful meditation on heroism and ambition, themes Napoleon embodied in both light and shadow. Opera also embraced the Napoleonic myth. Giacomo Meyerbeer's L'Africaine and Luigi Cherubini's Les Deux Journées reflect the turbulent politics of the era. Later composers and librettists would continue to explore his character, often blending romance and tragedy in their portrayals. In film, Napoleon has been an enduring subject. Abel Gance's silent film, Napoleon, 1927, was a groundbreaking cinematic achievement, using innovative techniques to portray the young general's rise. The film remains a landmark in cinema history, though it covers only a fraction of Napoleon's life. Stanley Kubrick famously spent years preparing for an epic Napoleon film, amassing research and designing battle sequences, though the project was never realized. In recent years, filmmakers have returned to the subject. Napoleon has also appeared in unexpected cultural spaces. His image is used in advertising to suggest leadership, confidence, and boldness. He appears in video games, board games, and graphic novels. Historical reenactments, particularly of battles like Austerlitz and Waterloo, attract enthusiasts from around the world, blending education and performance. Museums continue to shape how Napoleon is remembered. The Musée de l'Armée in Paris devotes entire wings to his reign. The Château de Malmaison, Josephine's residence, preserves personal items and artwork. Traveling exhibitions bring Napoleon's story to global audiences, constantly reframing his legacy for new generations. Ultimately, cultural representations of Napoleon reflect more than his historical reality. They mirror society's evolving concerns, the allure of power, the cost of ambition, the nature of leadership, and the tension between freedom and order. Each painting, poem, or film about Napoleon tells us something not only about him, but about ourselves. In the next chapter, we will turn to the international impact of Napoleon's policies and institutions, how his administrative reforms, military innovations, and legal systems influenced countries far beyond France, reshaping the modern world. The global impact of Napoleon Bonaparte extends far beyond the borders of France. His reforms, military systems, and political ideas reshaped not only Europe, but influenced the evolution of governance, law, and warfare in regions across the world. Through conquest, diplomacy, and legacy, Napoleon helped lay the groundwork for the modern nation-state and the global legal order. At the heart of this transformation was the Napoleonic Code, or Code Civil. First enacted in 1804, it replaced a chaotic patchwork of feudal laws with a clear, rational legal framework. It emphasized individual rights, property ownership, secular authority, and the equality of all male citizens before the law. While it did not grant full civil liberties and was patriarchal in nature, its structure and principles were revolutionary. The code spread through the territories Napoleon conquered and influenced legal systems in Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland. Even after his defeat, many of these regions retained aspects of the code due to its clarity, efficiency, and adaptability. Outside Europe, it left a mark on the legal traditions of Latin America, the Middle East, and former French colonies. Today, elements of the Napoleonic legal system remain embedded in the civil codes of over 70 countries. Napoleon's administrative model also set a precedent for modern governance. His centralized bureaucracy with clearly defined ministries, merit-based civil service, and uniform tax systems became a model for states seeking to modernize. He professionalized the civil administration, introduced standardized education, and created structures that allowed governments to function more efficiently. His approach to education, especially the creation of lycées and technical institutions, shaped modern public education systems. He believed in cultivating talent and loyalty through schooling, producing citizens who could serve the state competently. Many nations followed suit in developing national curricula, entrance examinations, and centralized universities. Militarily, Napoleon transformed the art and science of war. He reorganized armies into corps, semi-independent units capable of operating on their own, yet coordinated within a broader strategy. This innovation allowed for faster movement, greater flexibility, and more dynamic campaigns. His use of mass conscription, rapid maneuver, and decisive engagement influenced military doctrines well into the 20th century. Modern military academies still study his campaigns for lessons in leadership, logistics, and strategy. His emphasis on morale, timing, and initiative became core tenets of modern warfare. Figures like Karl von Clausewitz, whose famous treatise, On War, was shaped in the Napoleonic context, helped translate his methods into enduring military theory. Politically, Napoleon contributed to the development of the modern state by reinforcing the link between centralized authority and national identity. He helped dismantle feudalism in many parts of Europe, abolished serfdom in places like Poland and parts of Germany, and promoted a concept of citizenship that transcended birth and class. His example demonstrated the power of a unified legal, military, and educational system to forge national coherence. His reshaping of the map of Europe, creating client states, reorganizing borders, and planting administrative models, paved the way for 19th century nationalism. The rise of German and Italian unification movements, the spread of liberal constitutionalism, and the reform of monarchies were all influenced, directly or indirectly, by the Napoleonic experience. Outside Europe, the Napoleonic Wars affected colonial dynamics. The weakening of Spain and Portugal contributed to the independence movements in Latin America. Revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín drew inspiration from Napoleon's military tactics and national vision, even as they rejected his imperial tendencies. In North Africa and the Middle East, Napoleon's Egyptian expeditions sparked both admiration and fear. Though ultimately a military failure, it opened up cultural and intellectual exchanges that influenced Ottoman reformers and Egyptian modernizers. The idea of state-led reform, codified law, and centralized education gained traction among leaders seeking to resist Western domination through internal modernization. Even in East Asia, though more distantly, the idea of modernization through centralized rational administration echoed in the Meiji Restoration of Japan. Though Japan did not directly adopt Napoleonic laws, its architects of reform studied Western models, including the Napoleonic state, as blueprints for nation building. In the United States, Napoleon's influence was more symbolic, but no less significant. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, whereby France sold a vast swath of North America to the U.S., doubled the country's size and shaped its continental destiny. American military leaders studied his campaigns, and political thinkers debated his legacy as both a democratic reformer and an authoritarian ruler. In the next and final chapter, we will reflect on the lessons of Napoleon's life, his rise, rule, and fall, and consider what his story reveals about ambition, leadership, and the enduring complexity of power. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte, his rise, reign, exile, and legacy, is one of the most compelling narratives in world history. It is a saga of ambition and transformation, of glory and downfall, of ideals pursued and power corrupted. As we reach the end of this journey, it is worth pausing to reflect on the larger meanings behind the life of a man who forever changed the face of Europe and left an indelible imprint on the world. Born on a relatively obscure island, Napoleon rose through talent, timing, and sheer will. He proved that, in an age of revolution, a single individual could seize the currents of history and ride them to heights unimaginable. His career illustrates the potential of meritocracy, the idea that ability, not birth, should determine destiny. Yet it also reveals the dangers of unbounded ambition and the perils of concentrated power. As a military commander, Napoleon was unparalleled in his generation. He combined strategic brilliance with relentless energy, adapting to complex situations with boldness and creativity. His victories rewrote the rules of warfare and humbled empires. But war was not just his tool, it became his addiction. His dependence on military solutions ultimately exhausted France and alienated allies. As a statesman, he was both visionary and authoritarian. His reforms in law, education, administration, and infrastructure brought modernization and stability to a country reeling from revolution. The Napoleonic Code, still a foundational legal system, continues to govern societies across continents. His civil service and educational models became blueprints for modern states. Yet his governance was also marked by censorship, surveillance, and suppression of dissent. Napoleon's contradictions remain striking. He was the product of the French Revolution, yet crowned himself emperor. He championed merit and reform, yet established a dynastic monarchy. He brought order to chaos, but at the cost of liberty. He spread the ideals of the Enlightenment while curbing many of its freedoms. He emancipated serfs in one land while reintroducing slavery in another. These paradoxes make his legacy rich, complex, and endlessly debated. His downfall, while tragic, was not accidental. It was the result of hubris, the overreaching belief that no limit could contain him. The failed invasion of Russia, the Peninsular War, the relentless expansion of his empire, all were signs of a man who no longer saw boundaries. He had outpaced diplomacy, underestimated nationalism, and ignored the cost of endless war. And yet, even in defeat, Napoleon retained a powerful dignity. At Waterloo, he faced impossible odds, but refused to shrink from battle. In exile, he remained intellectually active, composing memoirs and defending his record. He sought to control his own narrative, aware that his life had already become legend. The lessons of his life remain relevant today. Napoleon reminds us of the power of leadership, how one individual, through vision and determination, can alter the course of history. He warns us of the seduction of power, how authority, once unchecked, can eclipse principle. He invites us to consider the balance between efficiency and liberty, reform and repression, national pride and international peace. He also forces us to reflect on memory, how we remember, why we remember, and what we choose to forget. For some, Napoleon is a hero, the builder of the modern state, the defender of the revolution, the military genius. For others, he is a tyrant, a warlord cloaked in grandeur, whose pursuit of glory left Europe in ruins. The truth lies, as always, in the tension between these views. Ultimately, Napoleon Bonaparte was a mirror of his time and of human nature itself. He embodied the aspirations and contradictions of the modern world. His life was a drama of epic proportions, but also a deeply personal struggle with destiny, responsibility, and legacy. More than 2 centuries after his death, we still study, admire, question, and debate Napoleon. He is more than a figure of history. He is a symbol of what humanity can achieve and what it must guard against. He remains, in the words of Victor Hugo, a thunderbolt in the hand of God. And so, as we lay down this final chapter, we do not close the book on Napoleon. We merely continue the dialogue, across time, borders, and generations, about the meaning of power, the weight of leadership, and the enduring question, what does it take to shape the world?